Welcome, thinkers, to Season 3, Episode 16. Today's topic is alignment. And today I'm joined once again by Scott, a.k.a. Optional Rule. Thank you ever so much for joining us again today, Scott. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much for having me on again. It's great to be here. My name is Scott. I go by Optional Rule on social media. I've been gaming for about 40 years. I've done a few small publications. I write a small blog at optionalrule.com. And you can follow me on Twitter for D&D advice and all sorts of gaming discussions at Optional Rule on Twitter.
Amazing. I think our discussions on stuff hasn't really stopped since the first time we've had you on the show, which is really good, and I'm very happy about that. So yes, I would encourage anybody. Scott is very open to discussions on topics. Talking of topics, today's is alignment. So what does that mean to you in the D&D framework?
Oh boy, alignment. Oh man, there's so much to unpack here. So we've got a little while to do that. So let's get into it. So alignment is the biggest nothing burger in D&D to me. Yet it's something we can't avoid, right? It's one of the most complex yet least impactful topics in the game. And I'm of many minds about it. So let's just start with a history. Like D&D started out with alignment way back in the original pamphlet. And that's because D&D started with this concept of like, who do I attack? It came out of war games, right? And in wargaming, very clearly, you know who the good guy is, you know who the bad guy is. And that concept came out of that like really generic definition of who a person is, right? That began in the earliest days of D&D. And I know that Gygax and Arneson had this very strong concept of your alignment, almost like your religion, that they would think that it was like a guild, some combination of a religion/guild where alignments would have languages. And so it was so deeply ingrained into the DNA of early D&D that we just not extracted it from that going forward, even though right now it's just in 5th edition, it's this quasi attribute, right? It's supposed to kind of define something about your character, but in the end, it really doesn't, beyond a little bit of flavor, maybe on a few spells like Spirit Guardians. You do necrotic damage versus radiant.
Yeah, no, this is going to be a great discussion because you can fill in the gaps in my knowledge from the older editions, and I can have the perspective of someone who's just come in at a 5th edition. And I'm going to open today's discussion with calling myself a hypocrite, which is great. But I always tell players when I'm trying to get them to engage with their characters, I'm like, look at the first page of your character sheet. You've got ideals, bonds, flaws, and traits taking up 20% of that first page. Like, the game is telling you those are big deals. Like, look at them, use them as inspiration, use them as motivation, go on from there. But then also you've got right at the top in the header block, along with your name and your class and your race and lineage, or and experience and stuff, you've got alignment. But that also does very little. So I can't really use that argument of like it's on the first page anymore, because so's alignment. And I'm inclined to agree after that first, what do I think this character might be in X many sessions time? I'll plonk down something middling because that's easy, and then never potentially ever look at it again.
Yeah.
And I think a quasi attribute is probably the best way to do it. And the more I think about it, the more it seems similar to backgrounds rather than backstories. So backgrounds in mechanically, again, I've got a couple of my players in my campaign recently. Unfortunately, 2 of them are re-rolling new characters because something bad happened to their first set of characters. And he's like, I've just got to pick my background, and I've picked this one for now. So I'm going to try and see how I've picked soldier, and I want to see how I can make my guy a soldier. And I was like, don't feel like bound by that, because that basically does so little. It gives you maybe some weird feature that exists in isolation and probably might never get used, and also some proficiencies. I'll give you some proficiencies if you want some proficiencies. Don't feel like you need to be a soldier for those proficiencies. Think about what you want your character to be, and then pick something that seems similar. So I think maybe alignment and background, like maybe backgrounds will go the way of alignment next, soon, and just be even less, maybe even more of this vestigial thing that's just knocking around and isn't there. Because for me, it is, as you said, like alignment is this one thing that you are almost forced to put down at the beginning of character creation and then maybe never look at again.
Yeah. Maybe you just defined one of the many problems with it, which is just placement on the character sheet, right? It's next to other things that if I have a high strength, I know that means I can lift heavy things. If I have high dex, I can dodge fast things, or I know lots of things with a high intelligence. But if you have an alignment, what does that mean? What can you do? There's an implication that you can do something because of it, and that it's just completely misplaced amongst all the other places. So maybe just like a first order problem is, let's get it off the top of the character sheet next to your name. Maybe it's not that defining. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I do think in first edition, that it meant a lot. It meant a lot. There were classes you could not take. Like you couldn't be a monk unless you were lawful. You couldn't be a druid unless you were neutral. I forget the list, the long laundry list of things you couldn't do because of your classes. But like paladins, only lawful good, not even just lawful. You had to take a dread knight or whatever it was. They came up with some class later on to let you be evil. It was a very disambiguous time, and if you D&D is based on pop cultural literature, right? And if you look at the time that D&D came up, it was the middle of the Cold War. We had very strong definitions of good and evil. Whether they were accurate or not is a different story, but we had strong internal definitions of them. And then if you look at the literature at the time, Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, there was a very strong, like, orcs are bad, humans are good. And I think the reason why it's so controversial today is because, well, actually, there's a provenance to how that got controversial, right? Because we got old enough to start to question, like, why are they evil? Like, orcs have a culture. Are they all evil? Is that... there's a great video by Matt Colville on this called Everybody Loves a Zombie or something like that. It talks specifically about the utility of alignment. The first order utility of alignment is, who can I kill and have a good conscience? That's the core of, like, who are the enemies? Who are the bad guys? Who can I kill? Because let's face it, no matter what your alignment, the body count for any player character is atrocious.
Yep.
Right.
And everybody, any many forms of media, many artifacts in that media. So like films, most popular culture films, most action films, who quote unquote the bad guys are, who quote unquote the good guys are. It's through decades, centuries of tropes to be like, those guys in black suits with the sunglasses on that don't have names, they're the bad guys. And like D&D is no exception. You'll have, it's almost kind of expected. And on the one hand, yes, it's nice to have the freedom of expression in D&D and TTRPGs to be like, well, I'm going to subvert that trope. But the risk you run if you do that, if you have these men in black guys who are, bald and have no names and are just hired goons, and you try and subvert that trope and make them be quote unquote the good guys, you can bet your players are going to be seeing them as the bad guys anyway, or at least a couple of your players are, because they've been trained that way for the last adult years of their life. So this is why I'm frustrated for the same reason you articulated at the beginning, that it's nothing but also everything at the same time, and I feel scared trying to talk about it when in reality, like, at any given table there probably isn't much sitting on the shoulders of alignment at all.
No, nobody cares. I tweeted about this a while ago. Like, alignment is one of these weird, there's no utility to the person actually playing it. It's what you want other people to think about either a monster or a player. It's just a quick way to sum up, okay, they're this, without having to get into their background, right? But it doesn't, I've never met a player who thought something was in character to do and didn't do it because it wasn't their alignment. I've heard people say, well, I'm chaotic good, so that's why I did this. But they didn't do it because of that. They did it because it was in character. No one's ever had like a great in-character motivation and then not done it because their alignment said something different. They always do the thing, right? So in that way, alignment is like a post facto attribute as well. Like you decide how you're going to play and then you write the alignment. You don't write the alignment and then decide how to play. So alignment, sort of a summary of all these concepts you've come up with before. So I think, I mean, it also lacks utility that way. And for monsters, it's just game masters have always done with monsters whatever they wanted to do from the earliest days. There's always been like Ferdinand and the Bull versions of evil dragons that like just want to sniff flowers and sit on a hill. And that's the earliest days I can remember, from the earliest days of the 80s, or good orcs or whatever. I have a thing about high and low culture. I'll put a pin in because I do want to talk about how I think it went wrong in the 90s and early aughts in a second. But overall, alignment has always been like DMs do whatever they want with their monsters. This is just how they want other people to understand monsters. So I think it's also weird in that way. It's always been an attribute for other people and not for the people running it.
Yeah, talking of creatures, I know that there's a push, or they're I can't remember how solid it is at the moment, but obviously they're going to in the newer books they're going to change in the creature stat blocks for DMs. Instead of just saying lawful good, it will say typically lawful good. I think is what they're pushing towards. And to me, I thought that was odd because I've always assumed it. I've inferred that from the whole game to me is flexible from the DM's point of view. Everything is malleable. I can change anything to be anything I want. If I want good dragons, no one's standing over my shoulder about to slap them on my wrist as I go and type in this is a good dragon or a good orc or something. I can do it because it's my game. So whenever I've seen hags are evil, I've just gone, but this one isn't, and that's fine. And I've never thought too much of it. So to me, that's from the creature stat block, it's almost again not even worth the ink that it's printed on sometimes.
Yeah, I'm torn on this issue though, because I agree. I think exactly the same way. Like, because I think I'll caveat it in a second, but at a space level, my thought is like, well, for people who, most people don't need that. I think most people understand the typical part. So I think most people don't. And for people who do need that expressly spelled out, I don't think it matters anyway. I think they're going to be ignorant. Ignorance is a very difficult thing to overcome. So if you're ignorant about it, it's going to be typical. Just saying typical isn't going to change those people.
Indeed, yeah.
But then again, my caveat is, then I remember, well, there are 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds that play the game, and that's one of the major challenges of D&D, right? It has to work for people from 10 years old to 70 years old. And okay, when I throw it in that light, I think I get it, and I do think they want to undo. Well, maybe we should talk about this now. There was a horrific turn that D&D took in the 90s and early aughts, where alignment became a statement about culture. Because prior to that, alignment was monsters that you ran into. You opened a door in a dungeon, and there were orcs in there. Like, evil, kill them. Like that was the extent of alignment, right? I know there's towns and lots of other things that happen. But generally, that's how it was. And one thing I want to point out, alignment has been subverted from the earliest days of D&D. Like if you look at Sinister Secrets of Saltmarsh, that's it.
Yes.
The third module in that, whatever, spoilers for a 30-year-old, 40-year-old module, by the way. But in that is a subverted alignment thing. You go against these lizard folk, and you're supposed to stop them from destroying the town, and you find out the lizard folk actually aren't evil, that it's a whole other thing going on, right? And so from the earliest days, very, very earliest days of D&D, alignment has been subverted. It was understood that alignment can be different. And the reason why it got flipped around was that as we got into settings like the Forgotten Realms or Birthright or Dark Sun or anything like that, you started to develop cultures around these monsters from the Monster Manual, and culture became a very strong part. Then people started to think, well, what do we mean by evil or good cultures, like an entirely cultural point of view? So they started to map that to what they knew, and they misaligned because there's this concept of high culture and low culture, and that what that actually is changes by culture of origin, but people began to attach it to what they saw as low culture. And in the orcs, in case of orcs, for instance, it's often one of the racial tropes that people say have been associated with orcs is related to African American culture here in the U.S. And that's been absolutely racist and absolutely bad. And I agree 100%. But it tells you a lot about the culture, that they reached for what does an evil culture look like. They misaligned and they landed on what they thought low culture was, which is, I'm not saying it is low culture. I'm saying in their mind, that's what happened.
Yeah.
And then they began to define it in these ways. Well, how do I express low culture? And they grabbed parts of their own culture and began to throw it into the game. And that was some low blow evil stuff, right? That was not great. And so alignment gave birth, this sort of trying to wrestle with what alignment is, gave birth to this movement of defining cultures, which gave this birth to this attaching to culture, and it just became this cultural emulation in quite a non-flattering or even, ignorantly non-flattering way. And so I think that's where it just, alignment took a bad turn in D&D. And people are sensitive about that now. I think that's why they're so sensitive. So when we go back to why did I start saying this, right? The typically part, what I think Wizards of the Coast is, and I think this is born from a good place. They're trying to avoid that same that same tropism that sort of generated out of the early 90s and aughts.
Yeah, it's obviously it's a shame, because I obviously completely agree that that's bad.
Yeah.
It takes very little critical thinking to be like, that isn't good. What's happening there? But it's a shame that obviously by the sounds of it, something that was very flat and two-dimensional then took this kind of weird and awkward turn to the place we don't want to go, and I think really driving out of now. I like to think I could be having my own ignorance here, which is quite possible, but I understand the tide is slowly turning towards a less awkward part of its usage, but it's like they've gone backwards before we've been able to go forwards in a way. But I think I've seen you mention online before in terms of, let's just bring it back to like mechanical alignment just for a second. If you hit delete, Control F, find all, delete, and just removed any references to it, would that resolve any issues? Am I like being way too simplistic here?
I don't think it would. I think that's why it hasn't gone away. Like it doesn't actually solve the core problem of, because there's some utility. Let's not completely. There's some utility in alignment. It's minimal, but there's the utility that does, for whatever it exists, extent that it exists. The utility is, I understand this is like a rampaging, arbitrarily violent monster versus this is this is a calculating, planning type of monster or whatever, whatever those kind, or it's just a beast, right? It's true neutral and it's just a beast that doesn't have an alignment. So that's the utility of it, and that is useful for DM. Like what's the consistency? There's a utility of a consistent experience in D&D, right? That everyone's playing the same game. I would even say like one of the big advances in 5th edition is this is the first time we've ever had these core modules where everyone is playing similar modules, right? It's like tracking a hobby through or series of a television show, right? Like this is series 1, series 2, series 3, now we're in Rime of the Frost Maiden, whatever. It's been useful. That common experience has been super useful for people. And alignment has a small bit of utility as it relates to that. It just careens out of control when it comes to world building because it's not even an inch deep. It's a small veneer of something over a very deep topic. And if you're unskilled as a DM or you don't know what that means, you have to really drill down a lot with your players and make sure they don't go off track with it. Because I've seen players be like, "Whoa, we have gone way off roading on this. That is not at all what I meant."
Yeah,
and we have to call a pause. So I've had that a few times.
Okay, yeah. I think that, so in a discussion we had on Twitter recently around this, Cobalt Sages, I'm trying to be good now with the podcast and actually reference people I'm talking about. Yeah. So that's it. We're like 100 episodes in, and now we're going to do it starting today. They said that it can still hold positive informational value, which is, I think, one reason why we haven't just done a find all and delete. And where's the line though? I'm perhaps my own, well, not perhaps, definitely because of my own ignorance. I'm struggling to find the line between the better implementation of how can we retain that informational value in a way that is socially correct and standardized and effective, maybe that's such a huge. Now I've said it out
Yeah.
loud. I'm like, yeah, Download. There isn't. Don't. You can't solve that because many people better than you can't solve that. So.
Yeah, in a weird way, I'm sort of neutral on the topic of deleting it. Like I don't see the utility of deleting it because it does do something minimal for us. It is part of the hobby, it's part of a long-standing tradition. And I don't think it does anything for us if we delete it. I mean, it's not going to mature the conversation.
True.
It's not going to redefine the monsters. It's not going to do anything concrete except make people feel better, which I don't want to trivialize. Maybe that does do something. I don't know. I'm an older man, so it's harder. I don't feel like it's going to change my thinking on it. I already think it's worthless. So that's why it doesn't matter to me if it's in or not. But maybe it does. Maybe for people who feel like it targets something that they feel connected to.
Yeah.
I don't want to diminish those voices, right? No. If someone says, "Listen, this makes me feel targeted," I want to take that seriously. I want to listen to what they have to say. And I get that. I almost never bring this up, but people talk about LGBTQ, all this other stuff. I'm somewhere in that in that range. I'm from a generation that doesn't feel like I need to explain to people where I fall in that. And so I've had those moments where I felt a little like, this is targeting me. I felt a little bit like that occasionally. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I did not mean to trivialize any problem as well, but
No, you didn't.
Half of this podcast is me just thinking out loud, which if it isn't evident by this point, it very much is. It is now, and yeah, and half of my problem solving process is just rubber duck programming, so just like repeating the problem out loud.
Let me toss a topic to you. I'd love to ask you a question. Do you think that alignment subverts player like role-playing growth? Do you think that makes players static?
So I thank you for asking, because I do have a whole section here on character alignment from a player's perspective. My answer on this would be there's two ways to approach this with baby's first players. Like, I don't know what a ttrpg is, and I'm sitting down and there's this 300-page rule book I've got to read through. And this is the thing you dress up, right? No, well, maybe if you want. Like, there's those kind of players, and then there's players who have had a number of characters, played in different games and whatnot. So I run a game with both sets of players in, and I think to finally get to answering your question for the new starters, like as I said, I've got a guy. He's re-rolling his only second character, 67 sessions in, and he got hung up on his background. He's gone through all the way through character creation. He's done all the numbers. He's done the standard array. He's got a backstory, and then he's gone, oh, now I need to pick a background. And I've said to him, don't get too hung up on it. And I think the same can be said for alignment. That they'll have a vision. Players might have a vision of, I want to play a character that does this, or does X, Y, Z in A, B, C situations, and then go, oh, now I've got to fit them on a 3x3 grid. And is that what are the implications of this? And I think that is a slight failing of the complexity of 5th edition, which I know has been streamlined, but is that it asks a lot up front, a lot of from new players up front. Like, do you want a longbow or a short bow? Means nothing to me, so I'll just pick one. Well, you shooting at disadvantage more often than you would be otherwise. Like, oh, screw me, I guess. In the same way that it can be like alignment. Oh, well, now I'm locked into being lawful good, but I didn't realize that my 4 party members were going to be, chaotic neutral and all off Robin Hooding somewhere, and I'm stuck like a stick in the mud, which isn't fun. And I never had that vision for my character to be the not fun one, because who would? So I think, yes, is the short answer for certainly for newer players who haven't had the experience of like, oh, it doesn't mean very much, or hey, the 4 guys I've been playing with don't care about it, so maybe when I roll a new character, I won't care about it. No one, as you said, to repeat what you said, I don't think no one goes out of their way to say, hang on, let me pass this next decision, every micro decision my character's making through this alignment filter to make sure no one has the overhead mental capacity to do that. Role playing is hard enough most of the time anyway, let alone another filter in the way. So no, most of it is from the gut, and this is, hopefully this is a legitimate reaction to the stimulus. So any small piece of grit in that role play wheel that might just be thrown in just to say, but is that lawful good? I think is not conducive because it's just going to get players to second guess themselves. And the one thing you don't want players who are, as we discussed in our last episode, being vulnerable, putting yourself a piece out there on the table, the last thing you want is for them to be self-conscious and then be like, oh God, what's everyone going to think if I say this thing because I'm not acting lawful good? So that is on one thing, is for newer players. And then, as I said, for people maybe such as myself and yourself and other players, it's a speed bump on the road to character creation. It's something that you maybe not even fill in, like maybe D&D Beyond makes you fill it in during character creation. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but if it's got to be filled in, you'll fill it in. But then I can, like, if you ask me what my two main characters are, I probably couldn't tell you what their alignments are off the top of my head. Level, class, background, main weapon, hit die. I could tell you, I could rattle off easy peasy. But then alignment, no, I couldn't. Cool guys, lawful cool. I don't know, lawful bit of Danilo's psyche.
It's a chaotic petty.
Yeah. So that is my very roundabout way of saying yes and no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm the same mind. It's not clear, but I think just thinking about it from that context is important for DMs. Like, what does it do? There's a first order thing it does for me as a DM. Everything else aside, there's a nice check when people are creating new characters. If I've got 5 players and 4 of them are lawful good and 1's chaotic evil, we have to have a talk, right? Something's off, right? What does this mean? How are they going to express things? So there's some utility for me to see my players do that. As a player, I find my own answer is sometimes it really does get in the way of character growth. Like what if I want to play a lawful good paladin? And always, like, the hero's journey, right? That's one of the major arcs everybody talks about D&D. There's a disillusionment phase, right? Where the structures that they knew, their betrayal phase, they feel betrayed by, like, when Luke finds out that Vader was his dad and he feels betrayed. Like, there's this moment of self-questioning that maybe I'm not lawful good anymore. Maybe I'm, chaotic good or neutral good, or maybe law doesn't. So there is an implication of changing alignments that does not exist in 5th edition. However, in early editions, in 1st edition, I'm not saying this was good, but it did change. Sometimes game masters would even change somebody's alignment. It's like, nope, that's an evil thing. You are now neutral evil or whatever. I was never a fan of that, but it did happen. And as a DM in 5th edition of lots of different players, I can see why. Because people usually call themselves good, but players are usually like chaotic petty, like I was joking earlier. Like they feel D&D is a bit of a power fantasy, so they carry over, like, someone who slights them. Any small slight becomes a big deal, and notoriously players burn down every town they go to because somebody looked at them wrong. Those are not good actions, right?
No.
So the earliest editions dealt with that by straight up changing it, and we don't do that now, which is odd. I don't think we do that as well now.
So was that literally in the book for, like, the DM had the power to literally, effectively go over their shoulder and rub it out on their sheet and rewrite something in?
I'd have to see. I don't actually know if it was ever said. I think it was. Like, my memory of it is that it was, but I don't actually know that that's true.
No, to be fair, that rings a bell with other people who've had experience in those editions have said something like, if you acted in a certain way, the DM would say, okay, well, now you're this, which means, and here's the important thing, which means that you've lost X, Y, Z and gained A, B, C, because back then there was a lot more tied in.
Yeah, you're not a paladin anymore. Yeah. Right?
there's a lot. I know, like, you can't, if you said that to someone like me, any just straight 5th edition player, if, like, you acted out, your character was in a rage or, was emotional and they did something that was not within alignment, to be like, oh, you're not that class anymore. You'd be like, what?
Yeah, that would
sounds
be
crazy.
For good reason. That would be like, wait a minute, because I think rightfully so. It's a great advancement. Now we understand what that really means, which is you need to, if it's that bad, you need to pause the game and have a talk, right? Trying to handle, because that's almost always an out of character thing, right? So that's pausing it is, of course, what we would do now. But back then, let's face it, most of us are teenagers and high, right? that was unfortunately common in the 80s, and so we weren't. You can't expect teenagers to act like adults,
No.
right? You expect it, but you're going to be disappointed.
Yes, yeah. I said because one of my notes here, funnily enough, it's very pertinent right now. I think I know your answer, but I was going to say, do we think it's the DM's job to enforce alignment? Now, I won't lead the witness.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I enforce? No, I don't think enforce. I don't think it's the DM's job to enforce anything, but I do think we're guides, right? Like and there's lots of legitimate reasons for that. People do things and it's a blind spot for them, or it's a blind spot for the DM, so it is a great thing for most games to sit down and go after the game or between sessions, say, this one thing that happened, I was a little thrown by that. I didn't quite get what was going on there. This is what I saw when this happened. How did you see it? What happened there? And it's a great way to lead into a discussion. Enforce, absolutely not. I don't think there's any utility to enforcing rules, alignment changes. I will say, I think that's a cover, which is another toxic part about alignment discussions. It's a cover for something else. If you feel the need to change a player behavior, you're blaming alignment for probably what is like a play style fit problem.
Yes.
I'd say 90% of the cases, this is a play style fit problem, or just a genre of the game or something like that. So to sit down and talk with them about like how that fits to the game, how it impacts the flow of things, how it fits with the world view, that's all within the purview of the DM. Understanding it's a discussion, not a declaration.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what it really is, and so yet many things that alignment got in the way of. Alignment was used as a crutch for what should have been a more mature discussion.
That I think is really hitting the nail on the head there. I've played in games before where the DM is, 5th edition again, where the DM has gone. The player said their character's got to do something, and the player's gone, but what's your alignment say? Like a parent telling off their child. Do you really think that your character would do that? Tisk, tisk, tisk. Like that's as far as it's ever got, which again is still a bit like, I'm not sure where I sit with that. Is that either just like the softest way to have that touch, or is that overstepping from a DM? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's just a crutch. You don't want to have discussion about like that kind of feels creepy. I've had players do that. I won't say what, but somebody, I had a player, you could tell the player was frustrated, not the character. You could tell the player was frustrated as this NPC who wouldn't answer their questions. And they started doing some pretty heinous stuff to them. And they were like chaotic good or something like that. And I didn't call an alignment halt. I straight up said, this is kind of wigging me out. We need to stop this.
Yeah.
I mean, and granted, I'm older, so I have no problem speaking my mind, but it just creeped me out bluntly. And that's a super important discussion to have. If someone comes at you with an evil alignment, you probably need to talk about, well, what does evil mean to you?
Yeah.
After the fact is a difficult time to have that discussion.
For sure. Thank you for reminding me, because that's what I wanted to mention earlier on when you said, maybe you've got one new character who's evil and the rest of the new characters are good. How does that fit in? And on paper, absolutely that's the trigger for that discussion. Like you said, to be like, let me sit down and find out, because you might actually have that chat with them and they're not in their head what they think is evil. It's actually like not that bad, or you know what I mean? Like they've just put that because it felt right, or it made sense, or their definition or their criteria for what makes something evil is a lot less. So you go, oh, actually that'll be fine. That's just, you're just playing a rogue. Like you'll probably get away with that. I don't think the rest of the characters are going to be that mad. But conversely, they could always be like, I'm going to kill every innocent civilian, and then that's when you would have that discussion.
Yeah, that's actually the killing innocent people or non-innocent, or just killing in general. That's a huge, I don't play, you have to level set. One important thing for all DMs is to level set in the world. What's kind of inbounds, out of bounds, what's typical behavior, what's atypical behavior. That's an important, That's why I love to spend the like level 1 to 3. That's what I do. I establish like levels 1 to 3 adventures are establishment adventures. What does the world think of certain things? Like they're afraid of adventurers because they tend to get like very sensitive. They freak out and kill people. But most people in the world don't kill people that they have a disagreement with. They might get in a fight, but it just ends with like, there, you've learned something now. Well, someone, holding their face or their eye, that people don't generally cut each other's throat at the end of combat. And I try to establish those things. Like even goblins don't do it because they don't care. Like they just don't care enough to do it. And so it's hard to get players though who are used to go down means they die. I would love to see a game where players were much more torn by that. Like they defeated their enemies. Maybe a good character went and bound the wounds of the people down on the ground. And they don't know this, but I tend to have the world respond to that. If the players are like, I used to term drooling slope foreheaded monsters, right? They're just murderous.
Yes.
If they're murderous, the world tends to get murderous, right? Although I try early to make sure that the world isn't that way. Although I shouldn't do that. This is one of the things like I subvert myself as a DM because that has this linear progression that it gets to a point that I just lose interest in the game. I'm not interested in these like a creepy power fantasy. Like power fantasy is okay. Everybody has a power fantasy about D&D, but it starts to get creepy after a certain point for me. And I'm like, I'm not looking forward to this game. And so I do think that DM establishing what the midpoint of the world is super important to give a lot of examples of how this works. And I think my players find this challenging because they feel like I'm sending them mixed messages, which I wish I wouldn't do, but I just want to. To me, being good isn't about being good in a perfect situation. It's about being good in a convoluted situation, like choosing the good path. When there are conflicting stories or it's not quite as clear, like that's good to me. And so I throw those opportunities, role-playing opportunities at players, but some people just want, I'm good. And everybody I meet who's like downtrodden is good. And that's not the world I run. So
yeah. I was thinking earlier on about, as I said, that like the DM enforcing or suggesting courses of actions for players based on their alignments. And yeah, I think as you said, like you could route a lot of those kind of issues with that. You almost need, as you said, in those levels 1 to 3, you need that. I think it's a really good idea. A lot of the focus on levels 1 to 3 is learning your characters, learning what a spell slot is, learning how to level up, learning what a roll to hit is with advantage. But I think equally, maybe even more so important for longer campaigns, is that if you beat up this guard, the rest of the guards are going to be really annoyed with you. Like don't hurt the local police because they will be very upset with you. You need to kind of set those tones out, and I think that's where I've learned in my campaign that expectation setting, which could be, you could level that at everything, because I don't really like to use it as a term, but what I mean is like my players were in a city. I don't know whether this is a video game trope or just a failure on my part, probably 50-50 to be honest, but they got mugged, they got jumped because they were flashing gold again. I was like, you're in a dive bar and you're throwing around like gold, which is like a lot.
Like people want to be your friend.
I was like, you're like, people are looking at you, eyeing, like dribbling almost. These are the kind of people that are spending a copper on 90% water ale. Like they're gonna want that gold. So when they got jumped and they fought off the muggers to the death, essentially. So when the local law enforcement turned up, all the player characters scarpered, and I've repeated them in game and out of game. I was like, you fled from the scene of a crime, bad boo-boo number 1. Number 2, you didn't leave them in a particularly pretty state. Number 3, there were a buttload of witnesses. Like this is middle of the day. Like you weren't, one of you turned into like a tiger, which is not very subtle. So so there's a lot of stuff stacking up against you here, and it's very easy. I don't want to rag on my players too much because I know when you're in the zone at the table, it's just I just want to roll dice and I'm having fun and la 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 la, and I've done that. Everybody's done that. That's
they think it's going to be something else, right? In their mind, it's going to be something else, and it just turned out, I underestimated this situation. I'm wildly off.
This is just the DM giving us some goons to fight in an alleyway. Just so we have some combat this session. And I'm like, kind of, yes, because we haven't had combat for a while. But also, you're still in the world. I haven't taken you out into VR training to have this combat just for a bit of fun to then bring us back in the real world. Like, it still has to make sense. So, as I said, a couple of them are rolling new characters now, and I think after all these sessions, and also as I've said, like, we'll have to make these new characters together, which is something I probably didn't do enough of when they first started, was to be like, maybe you want to think about what's happened over the last 60 sessions, and maybe you might want to tailor your new characters to be maybe a certain disposition or a certain way, and respond to situations in a certain way, just because, frankly, it will make your lives easier. You'll be able to travel in the city streets in daytime again as a starter for 10.
Yeah, I have a hard time with that, though. I mean, once we've got blown past something, especially if the core problem is really a misalignment about the kind of game the players want and the DM wants. Like I had one situation where I was running Lost Mines of Phandelver, and very early in the game, their first fight was some of the Red Brand ruffians, and they were bullies. They insulted them, but these players were way triggered by an NPC saying something nasty to their characters. Like I was a little shocked at how much it affected the player.
Oh wow!
And yeah, I was like, that's creeping me out a little bit. And it was a new group. It was a new group to me. We didn't know each other very well, but it wasn't extreme what the NPC said. He was just like, I don't know, something. And so at the end of the fight, they beat them, and the paladin drags this Red Brand because it was in a bar in the middle of Phandalin, drags one of the ruffians who survives to the center of town, douses him in lamp oil, holds a torch, and is like, "I'm going to light you on fire." And the entire town is like, "Whoa, wait a minute, hold on, what's happening?" And like everybody's freaking out around him. The player couldn't understand what was happening, like why. I'm being a guy from the movies. Why? Like he just couldn't understand. Yeah. And I was like describing everybody freaking out. And we even had a talk after. I said, well, this is not how the world runs. People don't generally light somebody on fire in the middle of a town square. That makes people feel very uncomfortable. And
such a nice political, like, that tends to make people uncomfortable, yeah, to say the least.
Yeah, well,
if I saw that happening out my window, I'd be very uncomfortable.
I would be haunted by that. I'm a veteran, so there's some. I tend to think about different violence differently. So So anyway, but that game ended up falling apart because the player, I gave him an out. Like when these things happen, you need to give the players a way back. Yeah. And that's sometimes difficult if they've really blown out the expectations. But I tried to say, okay, I think people just don't know what to make of you, but they're a little frightened of you right now. So you probably need to spend some time earning some goodwill with them, and it'll probably be fine. And they're like, oh yeah, okay. But when they were of the play style where they like went and did one nice thing for somebody, and they were upset that it didn't like magically transform the entire town.
Why haven't you given me all your life savings? I killed that rat for you.
I mean, it's not even on that one. That happens a lot in D&D, and I sometimes I try to provide examples to players of how this is not working out for them. Hopefully they'll get what I'm trying to lay down. And a whole different Dragon of Icespire Peak. So still in Phandalin, the player characters end up guilting the entire town into like, well, you should provide me with some fighters to fight this dragon because we're here fighting for you and you're doing nothing. And they're like, okay, we'll send some of our, able-bodied people along with you. And they through several successive fights, ended up every able-bodied person in Phandalin gets killed. Never registered with the players. Never. And I was like, oh, and this is where I'm getting into like, I'm sort of losing interest here. I played that campaign out, but by the time I was done, I was just like, I'm so ready for this game to be over.
Yeah. It's that. I love how we're talking about alignment, and we've talked about misalignment. You dropped misalignment earlier on, and I was like, I wonder if he's picked up on how he's deftly brought in the topic in that sentence between players and DMs, and also that struggle between, like, I've read it and said it myself 100 times, like the player characters are the main characters. They are the quote unquote heroes, or whatever term you want to use, of the game, right? The world doesn't revolve around them, but that's where the camera's on every week,
It
right?
might.
So so like they are the focus, but then in on the other side of the same coin, if you hurt the town's guard, you're going to get a reputation as somebody who hurts the people that are trying to protect 90% of the population. Like it's that struggle there between, no, we should, people are the movie stars essentially sometimes, but also they have to have expectations about what's going to happen if they act in a certain way, based on the context, and that is where the nuances, and that is where the misalignment cracks form and then widen open into pitfalls that where people fall in and go, I'm not looking forward to this game anymore because I found myself down this misalignment crevice that it's just got two people climbing up two different sides.
Yep. And something that's drastically different in 5th edition versus earlier editions is the official modules, and really even the player DM's Guild modules, they assume a point of view on who the players are. Like, especially the official modules assume you're here to be heroes. There's just, some of them are unabashedly that way. Like Rime and the Frost Maiden just assumes you're here to be a hero. So that creates this huge problem if the player doesn't want to. And in earlier editions, it wasn't assumed that. There was space for evil characters in the world. I never really enjoyed that kind of play, but there was space for evil characters in the world, or greed motivations, or whatever. So that creates a huge problem in modern sort of D&D. If alignments are assumed to be good or assumed to be heroic, that creates two problems. One, it may not align with players what they want to do, but two, this is a modern phenomenon. It creates a sense that anything the players do is automatically heroic because they're the heroes, and that's when if you follow that line of logic, that gets creepy. Like, I had to kill this village. It's like a very Anakin Skywalker, I had to kill the Sand People because they're evil moment. Like, oh, so Darth Vader's the hero here? Is that it?
Topsy-turvy world that we found ourselves in. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So I don't know how to think about that. I think that actually, to me, that assumption that players are always heroic and the DMs have to make it heroic, I think that's actually creepier to me in a small way, and that's not a big deal for me. But in a small way, that's creepier to me now than early concepts of alignment, where it was much more loosely defined, right? That this desperate need for players to always be seen heroic rather than earning it, rather than you should earn your heroism. That seems a little creepy to me in sort of modern expressions of D&D.
Yeah, no, I can see how it happens though, because despite all my stuff being homebrew, I very much had inadvertently, like at the back of my mind, assumed the player characters would be heroic. So everything I planned before we started playing was based on that assumption, and so I've had to change the way I do my planning based on, well, actually they might take it in this direction, or what happens if they take it in that direction, because of that it was a presumption essentially that was wrong, and that's fine, of course, as long as everybody is, to repeat ourselves, aligned and on board and comfortable and happy and all the other kind of stuff. And one thing I wanted to add earlier on that I forgot to bring in was when we were talking about, maybe you've got a mixed party and you've got 4 good guys and 1 bad guy. I don't want to, what's the word, to trivialize or to distill it down to good guys and bad guys, but for the sake of argument, let's assume they give me the benefit of the doubt. And one major reason is not because that bad guy's going to piss everybody off, but also because that player might not, that they're not going to have fun, and it's the job of everybody at the table to make sure everybody's having fun. But obviously the DM knows that a bit more than everybody else, so they're in a bit more of a position of power to be able to help that.
Right.
So it's that's super important to me. So most of my feedback to my players when they're thinking of, I want to be like this, or this is my background, or he's one of my other characters built in a rogue assassin subclass. So he's from a clandestine organization of hitmen essentially, and I was like, that's fine and that's super cool, but just so you're aware that your job is to kill people, and you might be traveling with others that might not look kindly on that. So you as a player might not have as much fun as you might be thinking you will do. You will be, I'm a cool hitman assassin. Yeah, great. But the game isn't Hitman. So
that's right. Nameless NPCs. Sure.
Being hitman assassin is great in the game Hitman, but not in this world that we have to be building together. So it's that is number one priority for me. So though sometimes it feels like I can come off and being like, are you sure you want to be an evil character? But it's because the next part of that sentence is because I want you to have as much fun as possible, and you might not have that based on the context you're about to go into.
Yeah. There's this is not a great trait for me as a DM because DMs have to have fun too, right? DMs
absolutely.
and part of the fun for me is like, okay, how far does this go, right? I love testing boundaries with players to see what they're like. How far does your character take good, or how far do they take evil? So when someone comes out, I'm an evil assassin, I've run into like progressively like the businessman, the merchant who just seems to be in the way, the family man, and it gets to be like, there's a point past which where I'm like, nah, I'm not interested now. With the play, and the player goes there. It's weird, and maybe I've muddied the waters too much. So maybe that's not a great trait for me as a DM, but I like testing. Like, okay, what does this mean to you as a character?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be good? Like, what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to put aside to do this? What are you willing to ignore? What are you willing to not ignore? That's the core of what's interesting to me as a DM. So for players who just want set piece after set piece after set piece, that's sometimes not so terribly fun for them. But that's where I am as a DM.
No, I like that. I'm the same. My point is if people are going to put, are going to be so bold as to put a strong stance on there. I am this lawful good, and I righteous justice to those who have, broken the law. Then I very much like to be like, all right, put your money where your mouth is, then, and we're going to define together what it means to break the law. What if it's and you build all the way up to the Aladdin street urchin who's just swiped a banana off the stand just to feed himself for the day? Are you gonna 77 smite him out of existence? Like, is it Wes?
Crit.
Boom. Like, is that that having those interesting discussions is what builds character, both I think of the player and the characters. And I have done similar things for my players to be like, okay, you've had your bits where you've run away and murdered street criminals. Okay, fine. Let me try and think of moral quandary situations that will get you to kind of contemplate where you really sit on the grand scheme of things. Are we, should we do that? But then are we not any better than those people? Or should we not do this and maybe try and start to think about the consequences of our actions? I think those are, again, to me, interesting to think about and to make up, and so I can laugh Machiavellianly while I'm planning and think, they're going to have so much difficulty with, this is
internal conflict is the heart of narrative, right? Action is a great excitement piece, but the heart of narrative is internal conflict, right? So that's, and I even love throwing in one of my favorite internal conflicts in a recent game I ran a Dragon of Ice Fire Peak game, and in that there's a white dragon is one of the big. I kind of combined Lost Mines of Phandelver and this into one module. So there's a green dragon north of Phandalin, and the players go to try to negotiate with it to see if it'll help. It will help take down the white dragon, but green dragons are very manipulative. So it entertains them for a while, and it flat out says no, but it hatches a plot that it knows the players are going to go after this white dragon. So it's going to wait until the fight happens and come in the lair in the middle of it and kill them all. That's a very green dragon thing to do when they're all wounded, right?
Yeah.
So middle of the fight with the white dragon, the green dragon lands in the entrance and it screams like, Cryvane, I'm here for you. And the white dragon turns to the players and said, help me kill this green dragon. I'll let you each take one piece of my hoard and I will leave. And so then they have to ally with a evil dragon. And it was a boss fight. It was amazing. That fight was amazing. And some players tried to betray the dragons, and it was really cool. But you wouldn't get that type of moral quandary out of traditional alignment roles. And that's not what they're designed to do.
No. That's really good. And I'm immediately thinking, like, how can I do something similar? How can I steal that idea?
It's amazing. You should do it. Use it.
I do have a green dragon knocking around, actually, who has got a number of spinning plates. There a number of machinations already in the pipeline. So that's wouldn't be completely out of the blue for something like that to happen.
Yeah, I liked it. It worked out. It was a stray thought of mine at the time, and when I didn't realize how good it would work out. So it ended up being fantastic for me.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you want? Well, yeah, I mean, we could talk about this all day because broadly the discussion is, philosophy and morals and what makes a good person good, which I'm woefully underqualified to comment on. But is there anything you wanted to talk about that we might have not got there yet?
No, just this is a hot button topic in the community. Alignment is a super, and I understand why.
Yeah.
And I like a lot of people, or because there's so much discussion online, and we've gone online primarily because of the pandemic. Sometimes I think it worries me, sometimes the bitterness of that conversation. So just in terms of a plea to the community, I would ask everybody to treat each other gently around this and any topic, and that they would, hopefully explore it a little bit to understand what people mean by it, rather than be, if they are, it doesn't apply to everybody, but if they are reactionary about it, I would just encourage everybody to be gentle with one another and to have an open discussion, not just to be accepting, which is itself worthwhile, but to evolve community thinking about what do we want out of this. If it's not alignment, let's figure out what does it look like to do it well, rather than just sort of be concerned about what we think someone else might be thinking about the topic based on a few words or a tweet or something like that. I'd urge us all to be a little bit gentle with one another. So that's my one topic. It's controversial. I would hope that we can be a little bit mature about our discussion about it, and generative rather than degenerative around the discussion of what do we want this to be, and rather than what do we want it not to be.
Yep, I was thinking while you were talking if there's anything I can add, but no, that is a perfect place to stop there. I mean, the only thing I will say is I do tend to pride myself in giving others the benefit of the doubt until repeatedly proven otherwise. Because even if somebody mugs you off once, they might just be having a bad day, and so until it's a repeated set of this guy's consistently a bad person, then there's my line in the sand. But until that point. Just believe people are speaking from their off the cuff or from the end of their sleeve, and it's not the end of the world if they say something, because it probably doesn't mean what you think it means. It probably means something that they couldn't communicate properly because of X, Y, Z, or ABC. So that's just life. As often the way these podcasts go, we end up talking about the human nature, which is poetic in a way here. Well, thank you ever so much for this discussion today. It's been fantastic. It felt like we talked both of us like a mile a minute, which is great because it's the enthusiasm is infectious, and it's, as you said, it's really nice and refreshing to have a topic, a discussion around, as you said, such a hot button topic as alignment, and it to be at face value isn't the right term, but you know what I mean, like constructive, as you said. So thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you for having me. It's been great as always. I really, really appreciate it. Love following you on Twitter. Love your podcast. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anything you would like to promote?
I'm really simple. I'm not selling anything. I just like to foster a good D&D discussion or any tabletop role-playing game. So give me a follow on Twitter at Optional Rule. No spaces, just Optional Rule. And you can find my blog posts on mostly D&D, but sometimes generic issues related to tabletop role-playing games at optionalrule.com.
I must admit, I have read a number of your blog articles, and it's something that I've considered doing. So you can take the gold medal for being my inspiration, because I've thought recently, like, I really should do one, because it's a good vehicle for having these longer form discussions that don't fit into 140 characters or whatever it is that Twitter operates at nowadays.
Thank you.
So as usual, thank you everyone for listening at home. All the Scott stuff will be in the episode description as normal. I would also encourage you to go and listen to our episode on agency way back in season 1 if you haven't done so already. Again, a fantastic and insightful discussion about, weirdly, like a number of similar things, but in a very different context. Like taking character agency away because of what they're doing is very similar to what we're talking about, enforcing alignment and all that kind of stuff. So another very, very, very interesting and good discussion. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and good night. And now it's time for the Patreon shoutouts. Huge thank you to a great friend of the show, Matthew Perkins, who's out there making hilarious and educational Dungeons & Dragons content. Please go and check out his stuff at matthewperkins.net, where you can find links to all of his socials and all of his content, including his own Patreon, which I would very much encourage you to check out. Thank you to Matt Street, at mpstreet88 on Twitter, for supporting the show. If you need support running your personal or business schedule, head to virtualtimehustle.com or on Instagram to make that difference between should do and done. Boss it better with support from Kat, who will help you get back that essential time you've been searching for. If you would like to support what we do and get 4 shout-outs a month, head over to patreon.com/thinkingcritically, or you can just buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/thinkingcritically,